Welcome to the Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast.
Well, hello and welcome again to the Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast. It is an absolute joy to have you with us today, as we've been hearing from such a wide range of Australian and global leaders in the area of church planting and cheering on multiplication within the Australian church. And today we are joined by Sarah Jackson. Sarah is the CEO of the Church Revitalisation Trust in London in the UK. And prior to that, was the Chief of Staff at Holy Trinity Brompton, which is a church known to many, many people here in Australia. Sarah, we are absolutely overjoyed that you would join us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Charlie. It's a real joy. And I feel kind of amongst family, love Exponential and what it does. And my visits to Australia, love what I see God doing at grassroots. So thank you for having me.
Amazing. You're always welcome in Australia, Sarah. Well, I wonder if you would start off our time together just by giving a bit of a backdrop to who you are, your ministry experiences, where you find yourself, and then maybe we'll dive into what is this thing called the Church Revitalisation Trust.
Oh, you're so lovely. Thank you. Yeah, so I am married to Tom. I've got three girls, three daughters, so he's so outnumbered. We do have a male dog called Wilbur, after William Wilberforce,
Wow.
the kind of the reformer, although it's the shyest dog you've probably ever come across. And I came to faith out of a non-Christian family when I was 13 and encountered Jesus in an extraordinary way on what was then very early days Alpha course at Holy Trinity Brompton.
Incredible.
And I was sort of persuaded to go and give it a go and just had the most extraordinary experience of God's love. And basically having gone through quite a traumatic time in my teens with our kind of family falling apart a bit. So HTB, Holy Trinity Brompton, has been my spiritual home for decades. And it's been amazing just seeing moves of God at different times, being led by the Holy Spirit. And I suppose I'm now ordained. So I'm clergy and oversee one of the services at Brompton Road. And my husband, Tom, oversees the kind of social transformation, all the kind of work with debt advice, trafficking, mental health issues. We call it Love Your Neighbour. And that's a whole nother story, but an exciting one that we've seen really take off over the last 3 years during lockdown, the pandemic. So it's been a privilege. I love what I do. And effectively, I suppose where the church planting bit comes in is I was there at those early days when we had a visit from John Wimber.
Wow.
From California, and he was so relaxed. I mean, here we were, Anglican church, kind of quite stiff, and I think the morning service still maybe had a few robed choirs lurking around, and he came over and always chewing gum and standing on the stage and inviting the Holy Spirit to come. And I think that was the first time we ever heard about church planting, and we were all like, "Is that landscape gardening? What's he talking about? And what's he mean? Send your best. We've got to build the church. We can't get rid of our best people." And he really challenged us and he shaped us to think about what could it mean to actually start to multiply and to plant out teams to reach into every area and every corner of our nation. So we sort of began doing that at HTB as a church. And to be honest, Charlie, it was quite haphazard. It was sort of like, anybody interested in this area of the country, this part of the city, maybe take a couple of friends, we'll give you a bit of money. Good luck. We'll see you next year at our festival in the summer. And I think we've made every mistake in the book.
Wow.
But it's only been by the grace of God that we have seen these churches grow and we've seen them reach into their communities. And so I think probably as haphazard, but as by the grace of God, we got a kind of bit of a track record working with the Anglican Church. So we work under the authority of the bishop. We always say we need three things. We need a bishop, we need a priest, and we need a building to plant into. And we were doing that across London for really a few decades before I think we felt we needed to be a bit more intentional.
Incredible. That's and not to compare or to intimidate, but would you give us a bit of a breadth of scope of what that's looked like. You know, as you guys have been particularly at this work since 2017, and of course you mentioned, you know, far before that as well, but particularly as the Church Revitalisation Trust has been doing this across the UK, what does that look like in terms of impact?
Yeah. So as I said, we've been planting, been a bit haphazard. Then in 2009, we were invited to plant into a different city. And for those who know the Anglicans, you know, the diocese, you kind of don't stretch out of your parish, let out of your diocese. So we were like, could that work? What does that look like? So we planted with Archie Coates, who's just about to become the new vicar of Holy Trinity Brompton, taking over from Nicky Gumbel. And Archie went with the team from here, from HTB, and took over what was a massive, it was like a huge, almost like a cathedral in Brighton, down on the south coast. And he took a team of maybe 20, 30 people. And what we started to see in 2009 was Archie and that team growing, planting into another city, Portsmouth, planting into an area called Crawley, planting into an area of really high deprivation, one of our really critical estates called the Whitehawk Estate. And we started to see this model emerge. And 2017, fast forward, there was loads in our national press about the church and existential crisis.
Wow.
All of our clergy are going to retire, and 10% of them in the next 10 years. We're heading over a cliff. We're not reaching the younger demographic. Generation Z is nowhere to be seen in our churches. And we have this sort of social commentator called Jeremy Paxman, and he wrote in the Financial Times, and he said, there are more supporters for the Royal Society for the Protection for Birds than there are Anglicans. And I always think that was kind of the last straw for Nicky Gumbel. I remember reading that and thinking, and so he sent me, I was then his group chief of staff, and he sent me this task to do. He said, Sarah, can you take some time? Can you map the UK? I want to know where there is growth, where, we're really good at anecdotes, aren't we? Yeah, loads of people came to faith. You're like, how many? Loads of people came, how many? So he was like, what is anecdotal? What is data?
Yeah.
Where is there growth? Every denomination, let's look at it. Let's look at, have we got anything to offer? What could we offer? What would the model look like? How much would it cost? And what would it take to reverse the decline of the church in our lifetime?
Wow.
And it was equally, Charlie, the most depressing month, as well as the most stirring month I had. Just thinking, this cannot be on our watch, that young people they're not hemorrhaging from church. They've just never been. We have people walk into the church and go, wow, is this what a church looks like? And you're like, have you never been at Christmas or Easter? And like, no, And so out of that, we just looked, okay, other people are doing incarnational, messy church, fresh expressions, so much better than us. They're just amazing at that. We're not so great at that. So what could we offer? And I think we landed on what we'd started years ago with John Wimber, this idea of a resource church. And it's a resource church that has got to be of a certain scale, because it's got to plant. So you don't want the donut whereby it's planted and then it implodes because the center's gone. It's got to be able to generate a growth. Doesn't have to be massive, but enough to be able to sustain its alpha course, its connect groups, its discipleship, as well as give its best away. And we always say, it's so painful giving your best leaders away, because you really need them to run your courses. But what's going to happen? But every time we did it, we saw God would raise up people, just amazing people, and fill those spaces. So the resource church has the DNA to replicate and to really love and to reach its community, and to serve the area. So for us in the Anglican Church, it's to serve the bishop, it's to serve the fellow clergy, to really make an impact in the community, and to plant. Wow. So we looked at, if only we were doing it, and we need every Baptist, Methodist, Pentecostal, we need everyone planting if we're going to move the dial in our nation. We're never going to do it alone. But if just us in our little area, if we were to plant 3 resource churches every year, that were to plant every 3 years, because that's our leadership curacy cycle for when planters can go, then we would start to reverse the decline in 12 years' time.
Wow.
And, you know, Charlie, every time we plotted that graph, I was like, we've got it wrong. We've got it wrong. This can't be, we can't be seeing this in our lifetime. And we thought, okay, we've got to go for it. So Nikki Gumbel, we need to set up a vehicle to accelerate this. We've got to go hard and fast. And we've got to play our part in what our vision statement is, the re-evangelization of the nation, the revitalization of the church, and the transformation of society. And we were committed. There's no better way, like Tim Keller says, to reach the unchurched than by church planting. It's the fastest, most effective way. And so we set up the Church Revitalisation Trust in 2017 as that vehicle. And we already had planted a whole network of churches. So we oversee that network. And effectively, I suppose I just started. I've got gumbled, is what they said. I was like, I love my job, Nikki. He's like, Sarah, how about you go for this one? I was like, okay. And wasn't intending on doing it at all. But I think, you know, when God stirs you and you see the possibility of what he could do in a nation.
Wow.
And Charlie, you'll know, but our nation's it's dire, you know, under 2% following Jesus, a generation completely missing from the church, post-secular, postmodern, post everything. And yet there is a hunger for more, and you can see it, you can feel it. I've got three teenagers, and you can see the questions that generation are asking. They're searching. So we set off 2017, and I effectively went and visited all the resource churches, and I asked them two questions. I asked the leader and the team separately, what is your biggest headache? How could we have resourced you better? And what is the obstacle that's preventing you from moving the dial? Is it money? Is it training? Is it people? You know, what is it? Is it the structures? All of the above, probably. And then I asked the team the same question. And it was really interesting. The answers were slightly different. And out of that, we created something that we called the Accelerator Program. So it's a 1-year training program on Zoom to look at what theological college hasn't taught you. So where are the gaps? Conflict resolution, building healthy cultures, you know, communication. If you're married, how to keep a healthy marriage and a strong ministry, boundaries, you know, finances, how to read a spreadsheet. So all these kind of different elements, because we found people could come out with a first-class degree in theology. They could be brilliant preachers, but as you know, it doesn't mean you're going to lead a healthy church.
Wow.
So what were the scaffolding that was needed to really train up leaders? So we started primarily early days, focusing on the leaders, focusing on leadership development pipeline, because we knew, like any organization, it's as healthy as the CEO. You know, the school is as good as the head teacher. You've got to have well-equipped, spirit-filled, Jesus-loving leaders who are humble, but actually are really brilliantly equipped, because some of them need to lead churches that are like organizations. So that's kind of where we started, those early days.
Amazing, Sarah. And just, you know, for the record, what does that look like now? How many churches is that? And what is the target that you guys are setting yourself for the future?
Yeah, so by God's grace, we planted 127, and we're about to plant 21 on Thursday. We launched another 21.
Wow.
So close to 150. But what we're starting to see is that the original churches that were planted, the resource churches, are now planting. And their plants are planting. So we feel we're moving from addition to multiplication.
Incredible. And
it's a dream that, you know, we were like, oh, do you know, we're out there. If we could plant 3 resource churches a year, and now it's like 21 a year. And it's as if, you know, God is like, we've given him our little fish and loaves and said, you know, we're trying to learn this stuff. And he's just taken it way beyond what we were imagining. And what's been quite exciting, what I'm really excited about, is that we're a church in Knightsbridge. If anybody's not been to London, we're basically opposite Harrods, you like the most expensive shop in the whole of the country. And we're not known as a kind of area of deprivation where we are. But I kind of feel it's God's sense of humor, because he's really kind of building some sort of I would say limited expertise, but some sort of expertise of planting into areas of low income and high deprivation. So we've planted nearly 40% of the churches into some of the hardest areas. And we have a kind of indices in our country of deprivation. So it's taken from income, employment, you name it. And maybe, Charlie, 4 years ago, I'd have like theological students email me coming out of our well, actually, we started a theological college about 10 years ago because we just felt a lot of our young leaders were going in full of fire, on in love with Jesus, and then coming out, and we were like, what has happened to you? What, you've been deconstructed, and come on, and it would take them like 3 years to recover. And so it's been amazing to see this theological college that we started 10 years ago. Now it's one of the largest, well, it is the largest Anglican theological college in the country. And young men, and also we've got other brilliant theological colleges across the country who are doing amazing things. But young men and women are coming out really on fire. And so maybe 4 or 5 years ago, they'd say, oh, if leafy Oxford or Cambridge come up, or Canterbury, put me down, I'd love to go there, or Bath, all these lovely cities we've got. But in the last 3 years, people are coming, young men and women, and they're saying, where is the hardest, most deprived, most needy part in the country? That's where we'll go.
Amazing.
And, Charlie, I get the privilege of sitting down with them and I'm saying, do you know what that means if you have a family? Do you know what that means for your kids' education? Do you know what that means? There's nowhere good for coffee there, and they're like, yeah, we are all in. And then when I get the chance to go and visit them, they're like, they've been planted in the Bahamas. They're like, isn't this amazing? And I'm like, yeah. So it's like God is raising up young men and women who are so sold out to reach this nation. And it's a privilege. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to give them every resource, every kind of support to help them. Wow. And what we've landed on, it's taken us a bit long, but what we've landed on is linking this resource church that we were talking about with a low income area. Okay. So we call them estates. We used to try and plant onto estates. We'd find the leader would burn out. There wasn't enough money to support a youth worker. It was tough because you're in there for the long haul and you're totally observed day and night. You're living in this community. There's, and as beautiful as it is, it's a very different thing from leading a kind of resource church with 25% turnover in the city and students coming and going. And but boy, it's precious. It's amazing. So once we've linked them, the resource church holds all the ops, all the finance, the safeguarding, all of that, which enables these leaders to hit the ground in mission from day one. And that's been a real game changer.
That's amazing, Sarah. Such an incredible story. And the reason I asked that question before around how many churches and your targets is because you guys are such a source of inspiration, particularly around what it means to start that journey, to set targets around some of those things. And it would be fair to say, as you mentioned before, as Nikki kind of shared around, the Birdwatchers Society, like at a time it would, and I'm sure your heart for the gospel is still driving this forward. At a time, it would have felt very bleak in the UK by way of planting churches and the great need for more churches. I wonder if, just for a moment, you could speak to what that meant for you as a leader and how you were able to rally yourself for that task at hand, of course, amongst an amazing team, an incredible church. And then I guess the flip side of that would be, what would you say to a listener that might be listening today going, I'm feeling that sense of bleakness. I'm feeling like it's too hard. I don't see the hope in it. Like, it just seems like the tide can never turn. Maybe you could just shed some light on that.
Yeah, such a good question. It's such a good question. And I think, I've learned it's battle and blessing. They go simultaneously hand in hand. It's never just blessing, and hopefully it's never just battle, but they do. And we say to the church planters when they come on our course, you're in for a roller coaster ride. Yeah. This is going to be contested at every single stage. And, we can make our great films and celebrate, but only few people will know behind the scenes, the tears, the kind of, I'm not cut out to do this moment. Somebody else would be better at it. I'm going to be the first one that fails in the network. We've had it all. And you don't see that because you only see kind of what's presented. But I think the narrative, I went to this conference, this church planters conference, amazing conference in New York quite a few years ago. And I was sitting in a round circle and some really amazing people I respect were there. And I'm sure Nicky Gumbel should have been there and I was there instead. So that was a huge disappointment. They got me. And as they were going around the circle, the kind of narrative, they wouldn't have meant this, but the kind of narrative I was hearing was, well, let's face it, we all know the institutional church is dead. So that attractional church is gone. So, and it was getting closer to the point where I was needing to introduce myself. And I was like, I could just go for a quick break so that I wouldn't have to say anything. And I got this text message from someone across the circle saying, you cannot move, you have to say. And literally, as it was coming up to me, I was thinking, I represent everything they think is gone, everything that they think is like old hat, passé, hasn't worked. And as clear as I've ever heard the Holy Spirit, Charlie, I felt him say that I'm in the business of bringing dead things back to life.
Wow.
And I just thought, you are, of course you are. This is what you do. This is your specialism. You know, the Holy Spirit brings dead things or things that appear dead back to life. And, you know, I then was able to say, well, I'm actually part of the institutional church and yeah, we're planting resource attractional churches, you know, and they were all very gracious. But I've definitely had moments of thinking, how are we ever going to move the dial? And those are the moments when I've probably taken my eyes off Jesus. Those are the moments when, you know, I need to go in prayer. I need to seek him out again. I need to get re-envisioned with, this is his mission. We're just joining in with him. And again and again, you know, I can see it with the church planters. It's tough. This is not easy, but when they're filled and equipped and when the Spirit moves, you see it's like, they're like, this is the best job ever. And I don't know, we're under 2% in this country, but I think when you look at church history, every time there's been a reawakening, every time there's been a revival, it's been preceded by the church being in a minority. Yeah. And the church getting on its knees and the church crying out with a real hunger. So part of me intellectually thinks this is a real crisis moment for the church, but the other part of me feels more in my spirit of, this is when we're going to be seeing what we're made of. Wow. When we're criticized for holding to biblical views, when we you know, people think we're like the local cricket club, we're the minority group. Yeah, that's when it gets tough for people to hold to their faith. But I think that's when exciting things start to happen. So I want to see everyone in the nation reach for Jesus. I want to see everyone across the world reach for Jesus. And I know that the narrative, even now in our secular media, is like, church is passé, it's gone. But I can tell you at grassroots, the stories of transformation, the physical healings, the people's lives being turned around, communities being transformed, because faithful churches are sticking in and doing what they do best, loving people, bringing them to Jesus, and he's transforming their lives. Wow. So I've got loads of hope. And I hope it's not a naive hope, because it's not optimism, it's hope, because I can see that Jesus is moving. And you know, he always has the last word. Yeah. And I believe he's going to have the last word. That's great.
Sarah, I wonder, just for those over here in Australia who maybe haven't heard of the work of Love Your Neighbour, you could briefly touch upon that, because that's been quite an incredible nation-defining initiative, particularly in the pandemic, that has done significant gospel work in the UK.
Oh, I'd love to. So COVID hit, and literally we got the announcement from our Prime Minister, stay at home, do not leave. And Tom, my husband, and I were looking at the congregation we oversee at HTB, one of the sites, and we were thinking, Flip, we can't get food for our family. What are they going to do? Some of the elderly, you know, and we knew, looking at the congregation, that some of them didn't have friends, family. We were it. You know, the church was truly their family. And so Nicky called and he said, would you guys head up the response for COVID for the church? So we sat down at home in our kitchen thinking, okay, well, what are people going to need? The first thing is we've got to get food to people. We've got to get their medication to them. And as I said, we're not known as a kind of area of deprivation in Knightsbridge.
Yeah.
And so we decided to raise some money. So we raised £10,000 overnight. And we thought, let's get some food. Let's get the food chain organized so that we can get food packages out to those that we know are not going to eat if we don't do this. And it was so funny because we were like, well, how much do we buy? You know, we had no idea. We'd never done it before. And anyway, Tom, my husband, was like, I think we should spend it all. If God's in it, we'll raise more. If he's not, well, we'll have a lot of food.
Yeah.
So we spent it all. We ordered this food. And on the Thursday morning, it was going to arrive in our car park at church, this big juggernaut. We turned our 24/7 prayer room into a food bank. And effectively, literally, just before this food truck arrived, we got a phone call from the food bank in one of the hardest areas, just near the Grenfell Tower, where we had this awful disaster in North Kensington. And 80 families depended on that food bank for their food pre-COVID.
Wow.
And it had to close down. So they just, out of the blue, they phoned HDB to say, we know you don't do this kind of stuff, but we've got 80 families desperate for food. Is there anything you can do? And we were like, funny enough, we got quite a lot of food arriving in about half an hour. Of course we can help. And Charlie, what it started was us doing this logistics of sending food out across London. First of all these churches got in contact and we contacted them. We said, we've got food. How about you tell us who's in need? You know the names, the faces of the most vulnerable in your communities. Who are you worried about? If we get the food to you, you can put your love your neighbor sticker on it. You can put your flyer in from St. John's or St. Luke's and say, we're here for you. How can we help you? We did a phone buddy that everybody was phoned and they would have a regular check-in. We phoned all the pharmacies across London and we said, can we send 2 volunteers every day to help you deliver, you know, any medication? They couldn't believe it. Most of them are Muslim. They were on Ramadan. They were exhausted. They were like, wow, is the church doing this? And all our volunteers, I mean, they loved it because they could also get out of the house. They were able to walk around legitimately. And very quickly, our network of churches across the UK said, we want to do the same. So literally we were like, well, we'll put a handbook together. We're only 2 weeks ahead of you on how you can get this done. And 27 cities started Love Your Neighbour with food banks, phone a friend, you know, how to help in the neighbourhood. And then Tom, my husband, somehow managed to access some government funding. Bearing in mind, in my whole lifetime, we've never, ever got government funding because we're just such a minority group. And, but amazingly, got this government funding, which we match fund up to 12 million. And we were able to give it out to churches, at which point Nicky Gumbel was like, this is too much just for our network. We need to go wider. So he then put a call in to this amazing group of head of church plant movements in the UK that he's been meeting. We host it every year for 20 years. Head of the Pentecostal, Baptist, Coptic Orthodox, Catholic Church, called them together on a Zoom and said, listen, this is what we're doing. How can we support you? And every single one said, we're on board. Salvation Army, who've been doing it like better for 100 years, you know, and they all got on board. So suddenly we moved to work with like 2,000 churches in every denomination across the UK, Scotland, Ireland, Northern Ireland, Wales, and mobilizing thousands of volunteers to reach people in their communities. And Nicky Gumbel said to us, you know, in the early church, when the pandemic hit, you know, it was when it hit Rome, the pagans fled to the mountains, to their kind of villas. It was the Christians that stayed to care for the poor.
Wow.
And the Roman Empire fell and Christianity soared. And every time in history where the church has run towards the need, whether it's in the Reformation or the, you know, the social reformers in our nation, there has been an extraordinary swelling of the church. So we just felt we didn't want people to think, where was the church missing in action? Yeah. We wanted the church to be right at the center. And we saw church turned inside out. We saw church buildings become centers for social transformation, food hubs, and we saw church happening in homes. And it was just the most extraordinary time. And that's continued. And we're now working across the UK to not just give people a hand out, but a hand up.
Yeah.
We want to break the cycle of dependence. We want to turn the food banks into social supermarkets so people can have dignity. We're working with re-employment with an organization called Resurgo to get people back into work and education, debt relief, you name it. There's a tsunami of mental health issues. So we're working with local GPs, and the churches are providing volunteers up and down the country to say, we want to help, we want to be there. So it's been an amazing, extraordinary move of the Holy Spirit. I've never seen unity like it, except for in Alpha.
Wow.
And it's continuing. And, you know, we're very good at saying, oh, bless you, you know, Methodist, Baptist, Pentecostal churches, you know, let's pray together. But when you actually say, we're going to share our resources, we're actually going to give you money, they were like, this is a different order of unity.
Wow.
And it's been a game changer. And we've got 80 hubs around the UK now working. And one church might have a debt centre, the other one might have a food bank, the other one might be doing employability, and they're working across the city. And I believe that the Spirit's doing something about loving our cities. How can we, and actually, Charlie, we're seeing it with planting now. If we used to think that church planting was like the frame of a bicycle, our first wheel was always evangelism. And for us, it's Alpha, because that's kind of the home of Alpha. And we'd be like, go for that younger generation, always, you know, open wide doors. But actually what we're now seeing is the second wheel of the bicycle is social transformation. We're seeing that Generation Z come in because they're all about justice. Right. They're all about authenticity. They want to bring their friends to the food bank. They want to see what we're doing about the environment. They want to, and then they're like, oh, why is the church doing this? I'd love to come on Alpha. So it's both and. So I think love your neighbor has really, well, we just think it's the holistic gospel.
Yeah.
You know, share the gospel and when necessary, use words.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah.
Sarah, I love that. Thank you for sharing that. And particularly for those who wouldn't have kind of caught up on that story, that amazing kind of feature of the last 3 years. You know, one of the things that, you know, even as I've started to learn more about the Church Revitalisation Trust and even some of the story that you've just shared, is it feels like there is an all or nothing type, let's go at this. Like, let's really, like, if crisis really does precede renewal, which is a Mark Sayers comment that I think you were speaking of, really, as to Nikki's sentiment of like, let's go for this. Let's do all that we can in order to advance the cause of the gospel in our nation. Like, what does that look like, I guess, from a bureaucratic level? Or like, we know it's not as easy as, oh yeah, let's just go for it. But like, what have been some of the steps that as the leader of the CRT, you've been able to help orchestrate to take this thing forward?
Yeah, such a good question. I mean, again, because we're part of an institutional church, you know, I sometimes are like, oh, it'd be so great just to identify a city, buy a warehouse, send a team. You know, for me, that seems easy. I know it's not easy, but it seems like, wow, you know, we would have done it by now. But actually, being part of the institutional church, it's such a blessing because we have a church in every single community in our country. And we've got more churches than pubs, and we're known as like a city of, you know, a nation of pubs. But what it has meant is that the kind of the challenges of not expecting the institution to be at the same speed, but being prepared to be innovative and being prepared to be entrepreneurial. And I mean, I just think maybe I'm just wired that there's an urgency. Life feels very short to me, and it feels like we've got this extraordinary message of hope. And why wouldn't we want to give every resource to go all out and do it? Of course, we've got to have balance, and we've got to have Sabbath, and we've got to remain healthy in the process. But one way is, you know, we'd really recognise that looking at the church, I'd say look bigger. We looked at the whole church and thought, you know, it's very white, very male, and it's very old. You know, our general synod, which is like our governance, and the parliament of the church, the average age is 70. So Nikki Gumbel has just been so pioneering, and we were coming up with more and more young people, really talented men and women from very different diverse backgrounds, ethnicities, socioeconomic backgrounds, leading our connect groups, leading people to Jesus, leading our alpha groups. But when you chatted to them and you said, what about being a pastor? What about ordination? They go, oh, no. There's no one who looks like me, who sounds like me in church leadership. This is not, they disqualified themselves. And so I suppose one way that I've just seen it is to pilot things. That we piloted the Peter stream. And it's, Paul, the academic, the erudite, great heritage, Peter, the rough fisherman, no kind of education. And Jesus says, on you will I build my church. We want to go after the Peters. We want to see them absolutely released into their calling, because we've got a diverse culture and they need to be reached by people of diversity. And the Church of England doesn't look diverse. So we set up the Peter stream as a pathway of training within our theological college. We started with four amazing young guys. And now it's much wider. We've got 70 going through, and they are going to change the face of the Church of England. Now, it hasn't been adopted yet as an official pathway of the Church of England, but I tell you, when they start leading churches like Joe O'Sullivan, who didn't get any GCSEs, no academic qualifications, he's currently done his theological degree, and he's leading one of our estate plants, and it is growing and people are flocking in. And when you see that anointing and you're like, of course, this is a no-brainer. We've got to raise up, we've got to call out, we've got to love people into the system. And then on the other end, we've got all these rural churches closing, and they're going to close and probably not be reopened for another 100 years, probably not in our lifetime. And that's bleak. You look at that and you think that's bleak, nothing's being done. But we've started this thing called the Caleb stream, which is kind of Caleb when he's 80 and he's going to go back into the promised land and take that mountain. And we've recognized that, retirement age, let's say you retire around 60-ish, the life expectancy is 80. You've got 20 more years of potential ministry. And I'm sure you can't play 20 years of solid golf. There's got to be something more. So we're encouraging these Calebs to come for a year's training at theological college, to be ordained as priests, and to then be placed in these satellite churches under a kind of senior pastor to revitalize churches in rural areas across urban cities, so that not on our watch will these churches be closed and never opened again. So it's innovation. It's thinking out of the box, I think, and trying to be led by the Spirit to think, okay, well, it's not coming top down. So how can we build it grassroots up? And I think leadership pipelines are absolutely key.
Yeah. Wow. Sarah, we could just keep talking. There's so much shared, but I recognize that our time together is getting on. Where could people go and find more about the Church Revitalisation Trust by way of a source of encouragement, learning from your story, being encouraged by what God has been doing in the UK, particularly to inspire them here for Australians?
Oh, you're so lovely to ask. Well, our door is always wide open to anyone. We're all about the kingdom. It's not one denomination. It's not one bit of churchmanship that is going to reach the globe. We need to do it together. And I think, we're really excited about 2033, the 2000th anniversary of the resurrection and the Great Commission. We want to go all out as part of that to really reach everyone across the globe, which we think is possible, Charlie, because of the digital revolution. So our website, emails, if you want to be on our newsletter, want to come and visit us in London, whatever it takes, we would love to support anyone who is wanting to plant churches and to re-evangelize.
Well, Sarah, you've been an enormous gift to Exponential Australia and sharing to our listeners, and we would just want to continue to cheer on and champion all that you guys are doing as a great source of inspiration for us. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for listening. For more great resources, please head to our website at exponential.org.au.